Hello everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome to the first Issues in Focus program of 1984. And we hope you had a good New Year holiday and that you spent at least part of it dancing and having as good a party as those people on the screen appeared to be having. Whether you danced with your big brother or your big sister is none of our concern. Peggy, it's the terrible year of 1984. Why is that a terrible year?
Well, I immediately think of George Orwell's novel 1984, and in fact our title, Big Brother, comes from that novel.
Right. We're unfortunate to have reached 1984 because when George Orwell wrote that novel in 1948, he may not really have had our year in mind, although many people who write for the newspapers and make programs for television have been thinking of his novel as a prophecy of our own year, and a very dark prophecy too, isn't it?
It's certainly very pessimistic.
It's about the way in which government becomes so powerful that it interferes with every aspect of our individual personal lives. Big Brother is that government personality who oversees everything we do, who threatens us, who knows everything we're doing at every second of the day, and that's a very frightening concept of government, isn't it? Do you think we've reached that point?
I don't think so. But there are certain trends in our societies here in Japan, America, Sweden, Europe, other countries in Europe, where we should begin to think about the problems of information gathering, for example, and individual privacy, and how strong we want our government, how much government should be in our daily lives.
Well, yeah, Orwell's novel, of course, was about government interfering in our lives. But what we'd like to talk about on our program today, for the most part, is government's responsibility for those parts of our communities, our societies, who are not as able to look after themselves as some of the fitter and younger of us are. And in particular, we'd like to look at the problem of the aging population in some of the developed countries. This is a question that often comes up in connection with Japan. And to look at some of the ways in which governments have to deal with this problem of an aging population, what kind of benefits they have to supply, what kind of responsibilities governments have to take.
Of course, in America, there has been a movement by the Reagan government to reduce welfare spending. We have some film, in fact, that shows aged people protesting some of these cuts in domestic spending.
I wanted to ask you, Peggy, why have these cuts been made, do you think?
Well, there was a need, or the Reagan government felt there was a need to balance the budget, and one of the first things to be cut were domestic programs, but we find, of course, that there's been a tremendous increase in defense spending, and whether these cuts in programs that really didn't cost very much resulted in any balanced budget is, I think, a moot question.
Well, do you think that some of these people who are demonstrating here feel that the government is spending more money on building weapons than on looking after those sections of the community that the government was really elected to look after?
Absolutely, as we can see from some of the signs they're holding up.
Yes. And they're interested, it seems to me, in social security benefits, in securing larger pensions, in securing lives for themselves after the retiring age that will be comfortable. But here we see some aging people at work. And
right. The government has, or there's been a move in American society to raise the retirement age up to 70 from 65.
And these people are still very active, aren't they? They still look as if they're full of energy and they're still displaying skills. There's really no reason why they shouldn't couldn't go on leading active, useful lives.
For people who are healthy, I think the choice should be theirs. But on the other hand, I think the community, the government, has a responsibility to help those people who can't work.
And perhaps those people who can work by ensuring that there are jobs for them if they want to work. And so the government has a responsibility in many different ways to a community such as the aging community. Well, we've been looking at some film from America, and I mentioned earlier, Peggy, that when we talk about the rapidly aging population in developing countries, Japan is often mentioned. And we have a guest with us today in the studio who is currently researching Japanese social policy toward the aging, and he is Mr. Stephen Anderson. Hello, Stephen.
Hi.
Thank you very much for coming to the studio. Stephen is a political scientist from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we've been looking at some film from the States, Stephen, but you've been dealing with Japan as part of your research. I want to ask you first whether you feel, as is sometimes said, particularly in the Japanese media, that Japan faces a more severe problem with regard to the aging of its population than other countries do.
Well, I think it's important to realize that Japan faces a situation of more rapid aging than any other society. While this is true in Japan, it's also true in many other societies. It's just the rapidness with which this is growing. The real problem in Japan is whether there will be higher expenditures for social welfare and what the government will do to face this problem. Now, at the macro level, we have to look at how government responds. I also think at the micro level, we have to realize that individuals are really affecting this change. One thing that I think is very interesting is that women have made choices that may have a lot to do with this change. The birth rate has dropped in Japan. And so I feel that there are several layers of this problem, both at the micro and macro level.
In other words, women have made the choice to have fewer children, so that's one of the reasons why the percentage of the population of elderly is increasing.
And that's right. I have a chart that I brought with me to show you some of the trends that are occurring throughout industrial societies. Not only in Japan have we seen this trend toward the aging, but also in Europe and in the United States. Japan, even at this point, still does not have a higher percentage of aging.
We're looking at your chart. Stephen, could you tell us very briefly what this shows us?
The dotted line shows us where we are now, the black dotted line that goes from the top to the bottom of the chart. That's 1984. Japan still is at about 10% of its population being over the age of 65. What we see is, in the future, Japan's trend rising rapidly to approach those of the examples we have here, Britain and West Germany. Another example not on the chart is Sweden, which would be about 5 percentage points above where Britain started, and going to about 2 or 3% above Britain and West Germany even at the present time. Japan approaches that level and then passes it as we approach the 21st century.
We think of the industrialized, the developed countries as having all kinds of benefits which the third world countries and poorer countries don't share, but we are talking now about one of the problems that is hitting specifically the developed countries, aren't we? This problem of a rapidly aging population as life expectancy grows.
That's correct, and the birth rates are dropping in individual families as people decide to have smaller family sizes.
Do you have some comparative data about different countries and how much they are spending on social welfare benefits?
If we go to the second chart, you can see what the responses of different governments have been to these problems. On the far left, we have examples about health insurance, and in the center, pensions, and on the far right, other Social Security benefits. In these charts, you can see that the United States and Japan tend to be smaller in their responses to these different programs. Japan is it's the second column in health insurance, the first column in pensions, and the first column in other Social Security benefits. The two different colors, the red is 1960, and the brown is 1980 data. So you can see, as societies age, they tend to spend more money on different social welfare programs.
Yeah, now what we're also seeing here, of course, is 3 of the different categories where governments really should be helping that particular sector of the community, the aging sector of the community that we're talking about. That is in health, in pensions, and in other kinds of social security benefits. Well, now, we've been talking about America and Japan and looking at some comparative figures there. We'd like to talk about one more country, and this is a country that is often mentioned in discussions of the welfare state, because it is a country which has had a firmly established welfare state for some years that has been doing for its citizens, or attempting to do for its citizens, precisely those things that we're discussing.
And that country, of course, is Sweden.
Right. We have a piece of film which shows some aspects of the way in which the welfare state works in Sweden. And we'd like to look at it, and as we look at it, let's talk about it, Peggy.
Of course, Sweden is a small, wealthy country with a very homogeneous population and culture. But we find in Sweden that 17% of the population are elderly, which of course is more than in Japan at the
You
moment.
said how many in Japan? 10%?
About 10% of the population at present.
Yeah.
So Sweden is in fact facing, or has faced, problems of an aged society sooner than many other societies like Japan.
Yes. How has it met these problems, Peggy?
I think Sweden, since certainly before World War II, has invested in social benefits in a wide range of social programs, health care, pension plans, and of course programs that don't deal with the aged, for example, education, child care. So a Swede from birth to death can rely on the government for many aids, benefits in maintaining a standard
I
of
think
living.
throughout the world, people have considered Sweden the model welfare state in most studies.
Do you think that's a valid assessment of the situation there, Stephen?
Most of my reports are that the state does provide a great deal of services for the elder, for all people in need in Sweden.
Do you think Sweden is a good model for, say, Japan or America?
Well, I think each country has to be its own model, but Sweden is much closer to the Japanese case than many other societies because it's so homogeneous, first of all, and for other reasons as well as far as its development.
Does that, Stephen, does that homogeneity mean, do you think that it's easier to institute a welfare state of the kind that Sweden has? It doesn't have racial conflicts within its own?
Well, the issues are different. I think that in the United States, welfare also becomes an arena for the conflict between ethnic groups and different
Of course, when we talk about providing social welfare benefits, it means that government grows and also that the information gathering, the data keeping function of government must grow.
Now, we're seeing here, Peggy, what? We're seeing some
The
kind
Swedish
of central...
one of this data keeping centers in Sweden for the government.
Yeah, it was this sort of thing that Orwell was talking about, but in a much more pessimistic and darker way than we're seeing on our screens here. He was talking about the fact that as government grows, it begins to need more information about us as individuals, and the question arises about how we can safeguard our individual liberties, our freedoms, and not let people who ought not to have access to that information have it.
In fact, Sweden has been very concerned about protecting citizens' privacy. And there is this Data Act, which was implemented in 1973 to protect privacy, to regulate who could keep data, the kinds of data that could be kept, and who had access to the data. Of course, Sweden has a history of open access to most public records, so it's a balance. Individuals and responsible people do have access to certain data. But on the other hand, an individual's right to privacy is protected by the new Data Act.
I think it's interesting to note with Orwell that he observed the television as being a potential source of abuse in society. Every apartment had a television screen.
And the screen was watching the viewers rather than the viewers watching the screen.
Well, we've managed to control television more or less, and I think perhaps we'll be able to do the same with computers.
Let's hope so.
Well, we have one more guest in the studio today, Yumiko Jansson Yanagisawa, who has lived in Sweden since the early 1970s. She's a writer and a translator and is here to fill us in a little bit more about the Swedish example.
Well, we've seen some film of Sweden there, Yumiko, and in particular of the way in which the elderly population in Sweden seems to be enjoying the benefits of that welfare state that is often set up as a model that other countries might follow. Your experience in Sweden, has it led you to think that the welfare state is functioning well? Is it really benefiting the population to the extent that we see it in film?
Yes, generally speaking, yes. Especially about elderly people, I would like to point out that they have the basic need for living, which is offered by the society. That is to say, they have pension system, they have medical aid, and also they have housing allowance. And these aids from society, they really do enjoy having them, and I'm sure that Swedish people cannot live without these social welfare nowadays.
When you talk about these benefits that are provided to the elderly or daycare centers or whatever throughout society, this costs money. Do Swedes complain about the taxes they have to pay?
Well, there are always people who complain about tax and high tax and so on. But in fact, you see the result of tax, what you have paid. You see, it's free education in Sweden, and also hospital care. When you are sick and you go to hospital, you pay only 30 crowns, which is equivalent 1,000 yen in Japanese yen.
That's to stay in hospital? To be admitted to hospital?
To be admitted in hospital and stay in a hospital and medicine prescription. And also the certificate from a doctor to show the social welfare office to get the social benefits.
In other words, these benefits are going to all levels of society. In other words, not just the elderly, but everyone. People who are paying taxes are also seeing the direct benefits.
We're talking about the elderly mainly, but the welfare state ought to be a state that helps all sections of the community that need help, the handicapped, the unemployed, any section that in some area of life can't take care of itself. But Yumiko, looking at that film, I was so impressed by the radiance, the happiness of those old elderly people in Sweden. You've lived in Sweden. Of course, you've also lived in Japan, which Stephen pointed out to us earlier is a country which doesn't have this tradition of government support to the extent that Sweden has for the aging and other such communities here. Do you feel that Swedish elderly people are happier than the elderly in Japan?
It's not that easy to answer if they are happy or if they are not happy compared with Japanese elderly people. One thing which I can say is that they are independent. Well, for the first, they can live alone with a pension which they enjoy, and also they are in the society where people live alone with the help of society. So it means that you are not desperately depending on your children or your relatives, which is the case here in Japan.
That's an interesting observation, because there really are no outside supports for elderly people once they retire. The average retirement
in Japan, Stephen?
The size of those supports are not to the extent they are in Sweden. And once you retire, an average retirement is 58 years of age. You oftentimes have to rely in Japan on your family or your savings or your bonus that you receive at your retirement in a way that what you've described in Sweden, it just does not occur.
Well, it's worth pointing out, I think, that some parts of the Japanese community feel that traditional strength of the family, the ability of the old to depend upon the young, and the responsibility that the young take for the elderly members of their family is in fact a source of strength in Japan. And, you know, we've had the example recently we've talked about on our own program, Peggy, of juvenile delinquency, you know, and it has been said that one of the causes of juvenile delinquency in Japan is the erosion, the collapse of the traditional family structure, the strength of the family.
Well, I think that it's true that there is a change going on in Japanese society, but it's been occurring for many years. That more than half of the workforce, women's workforce, are women that are married now. We don't have the housewives that we formerly thought of as being the basis of a Japanese community. It's just not the same situation as it was in the past. We don't have that traditional family.
In other words, you're saying that when we talk about giving the responsibility to the family, we really mean that responsibility goes to the woman in the family.
Exactly. I wanted to continue what Stephen said right now. You know, some time ago, Japanese government gave out the principle of future social welfare in Japan. That was based on the welfare should be taken care of by the family. And when people say family, the key person in the family is a woman. But just as Stephen mentioned, the reality of Japanese women's status is that many women, more than one, every other woman is out and working. And so people believe that women should take care of the old people, sick people, and small children. But in reality, women are not at home any longer.
You see this pressure emerging in the demand for daycare in Japanese society. It really has boomed that people need new daycare centers, and if you look within Tokyo, you see that it's not the old pattern of sending your children to your grandmother's house. That still occurs, and people make their own individual decisions about how to care for their children while they work. But the patterns are changing.
Of course, about 2/3 of the Japanese elderly do live with their families. So I think the rate is still much higher than in countries like Sweden.
Not necessarily a bad thing, is it,
No.
Peggy? I mean, I think that
There should be a balance, I think, and a choice, if possible, for the individuals involved.
Yes, what government has to do is fill in the gaps, isn't it, more than anything else? It's to provide care and opportunities for people who don't have them in other areas.
And I think that's when you talk about gaps, and we look at the Japanese social system. Stephen, you were speaking a moment ago about the people who fall through the cracks. For example, those who retire early at 55 and get basically no pension, certainly from the government, until they're 65. Do you think Japanese society is going to change to help these people?
Well, I think that the government will have to, and has already begun, several new programs. Since I think that the foremost among these programs was the medical care program passed in 1972 and 73, developed in those years. There have been many innovations, and I do think the Japanese government responds very well to these problems. The tension comes in when you look at how you're going to pay for the programs. Japanese government deficits have been a major problem for several years, and that's a tension we have to address.
Obviously, taxation level is one consideration, one drawback possibly to the kind of welfare state that we've been looking at. But Yumiko, I'd like to ask you, because we began our program with Orwell and talking about his fear that government can become too big. You know, it can, not only does it start helping you, but it starts actively interfering. Now, are there any signs of that happening in Sweden? Do people feel that the government is in some way a big brother who is overlooking them when they don't want to be overlooked?
There is a fear. Since last year, I think there was a big discussion in Sweden, and especially it was focused on the Central Statistic Bureau. Their opinion is to centralize all the information in one place
in one big computer.
Yes, exactly.
That's terrible.
As it looks now is social insurance system and taxation system and also personal, data
Like
about
health records or
about
something
your
like that.
marital stage and all these things were divided into the authorities which is taking care of this field. But now the Central Statistic Bureau tried to come with a proposal to unite all this information in one system and became a very big storm everywhere in Sweden. People are against this tendency and it is stopped.
Why are they against it? Because that information can be abused, because people who shouldn't have access to that information will have it if it's centralized in that way?
And also people are afraid that the central body will become too big and individuals' right to come and get the information will not be regarded as it has been before.
Yeah, I do agree that social welfare programs are often a terrain where different groups in society who are needy are not taken care of very well. But emphasizing Orwell throughout the show, Orwell often said that the state was a menace because of problems about totalitarianism. In his autobiography, he said he had actually been writing for many years about democratic socialism. And it's interesting how his example has been taken by many groups for many reasons.
I think the emphasis has been on the abuse of power by government, whereas in fact what we should be emphasizing is the responsibility of government to the individuals. And we are the people who elect government, at least in the democracies we are, and really it's our job, as much as governments, to ensure that there are safeguards, that there are laws which prevent both government and individuals and private corporations from abusing the information that is available either centrally or in other areas. I'm afraid that we have run out of time and I have to bring the discussion to an end there. We've called our program Big Brother. Orwell's emphasis was on the bigness of government, the overpoweringness of government. Maybe if we were to emphasize the brotherliness of government and the way in which it should, like a good member of the family, take care of its aged, we'd be on a more optimistic track. It's goodbye from Stephen Anderson, from Yumiko Jansen Yanagisawa, from Big Sister and Big Brother. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.